Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. Tina Valtierra, and I am a faculty member in the Education Department, for those of you that I don't know. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. Wayne Au, our distinguished speaker this evening. Dr. Au is a professor in the School of Educational Studies, an interim chief diversity officer at the University of Washington, Bothell. He's an editor for the popular social justice teaching magazine, Rethinking Schools. An old hip-hop head and retired DJ, Dr. Au's work has focused generally on critical education theory, critical policy analysis, and teaching for social justice. Dr. Au has over 100 publications in the field, and his work has been translated into 3 different languages. He is engaged in scholarship about high-stakes testing, social studies education, curriculum studies, and multicultural education. Dr. Au has been presented with numerous distinguished awards over his career. For instance, in 2002, Dr. Au was presented with the Early Career Advocate for Justice Award from the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. And then just last year in 2017, Dr. Au was awarded the William H. Watkins Award for Scholar Activism from the Society of Professors of Education. These are just 2 examples of the many distinguished awards Dr. Au has earned over the years. Now, before I hand it off to Wayne, I want to acknowledge my colleagues in the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Multicultural Education, the entire CC Education Department, with a special shout out to Deborah Mortensen and Yuna Ng for coordinating and advertising this important event. And finally, thank you to the Office of the Provost for their support in encouraging community members to attend this evening's talk. Without further ado, let's give it up for Dr. Wayne Au.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. First, I want to thank Dr. Valtierra for bringing me out here, and you've been great in helping coordinate everything in Colorado College. I'm glad we were able to make something happen. Originally, I was supposed to come out to keynote for Colorado Name, and then Colorado Name sort of it sort of fizzled a little bit, and then we were like, hey, let's still bring you out here. So we were able to make it happen. I also want to, today I'm going to talk, sort of think about a few different things. Part of it is going to raise the question of how do we think about multicultural education within today's context. And so I'm going to bring up some of the politics of sort of what's going on and some of the struggles that folks are engaged in on the ground and things that I'm involved with, both as a professor and also a public school parent in Seattle. And then also talk through some frames around multicultural education and how do we understand those. And then in part because I was asked to, and in part because I'm doing some of this work now as a quote-unquote diversity administrator at my university, talk a little bit about some of the things and struggles around higher education relative to this stuff as well. So, but before I even get into that, I always want to make sure when I give talks in different places, just sort of recognize that we're standing, sitting, we're here, basically what's Ute and Cheyenne lands. Right? And we're here literally as a vestige and the ongoing act of settler colonialism on this space, right? Our institutions, our universities, our cities in the West, we're on native land. And there's been a whole process of colonization and that gets sort of maintained both for us as institutions, but also it gets maintained through the sort of invisibilizing of indigenous communities. And so I always want to make sure to vocalize that and make sure we're thinking about that and have that in the air as we move in to talk about these kinds of issues. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little story, and if some of this stuff, if you were at NAME in Utah, I talked about some of this before, and this is written about in my colleague Jesse Hagopian and I wrote about this in a chapter both for Rethinking Schools, but also in Teaching for Black Lives, which is a book that I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, let's see if I got the right buttons. Okay, I'm going to start with a story. This is a picture of a T-shirt, okay? It says Black Lives Matter. We stand together, John Muir Elementary. Now, John Muir Elementary is my son's elementary school. It's about a block away from our house in Seattle, Washington. It's in South Seattle, Seattle's Rainier Valley. John Muir Elementary is about 69% free and reduced lunch. It's over half African American. It's about maybe 25% Latinx and ELL, large immigrant and Muslim population as well. The staff at John Muir Elementary for quite a few years have been sort of taking part in building their capacity around doing racial justice in education and thinking about that in terms of policy, in terms of curriculum, in terms of pedagogy and practice. And so one of the staff, Deshaun Jackson, who's wonderful, wanted to do a pretty basic thing, and you may have something here similar in the area where it was something he was calling 100 Black Men Changing the Narrative in Education. And basically it was to have 100 Black men come to school and line up and give the kids high fives on the way into school. We do it a lot in Seattle. It happens at a lot of elementary schools. And so he was planning that, and the staff, who had been doing some of this racial justice work as staff, decided to do some solidarity work. And so the art teacher, Julie Trout, who's amazing, she designed the T-shirt, and they printed the T-shirts, and the staff was going to wear them. The teachers were going to wear them on this same day. Now, then something happened. Someone leaked it to the local news station that these T-shirts were made and were going to get worn by the staff. Okay, and so then what happened was that Breitbart, the alt-right, super conservative news website, news in quotes, picked it up. So did Blue Lives Matter. Okay, and so suddenly there was this big sort of surge of like calls to the school, calls to the district. Emails, really strong attack. I remember the principal at the school, bless her heart, was just like she had never been in a firestorm like this before. And so we spent a day, we walked around the block together, and I just had to talk her down and be like, it's okay. These cycles move quickly. In a week, it'll be mostly over, right? But we just had to get there. But anyways, on a chat room somewhere related to these websites, someone said they were going to blow up the school. Okay, and it's something I want folks to always think about really deeply around this, because I mean, here's a school with we're talking 5-year-olds to 12-year-olds, right? And they're mostly black and brown kids, right? And mostly working class black and brown kids, and a lot of Muslim kids, and a lot of immigrant kids. There's undocumented kids, right? And so what does it take for somebody to actually go to be like in a space where they're willing to go make a threat and really put out the idea in the universe that they're gonna kill these kids, right? I mean, think about that. That's to me, it's unconscionable. So this thing obviously just blew up for us. I don't mean that literally, right? So officially, Seattle schools canceled the event. They're like, you can't do your Black Men United to Change the Narrative event, and that got canceled officially. But something also happened. It became a galvanizing point both for the school and for the district. And so other schools and the union came together, and they were like, teachers union came together, and like they passed, like people started doing solidarity statements, right? And then the union was like, hey, we need to be in solidarity with the teachers at John Muir. We can't let these threats stand. And so then talks started happening about having, hey, let's have a Black Lives Matter in School Day across Seattle schools. Okay, so that conversation started happening. And then also, perhaps the most beautiful thing about it, okay, was that the day came, even though it was officially canceled, and it was as a parent, it was, for me, as someone who's a parent at that school, it was, it was a little bit of a trip, because what they did is they didn't close school for the day. They, of course, let the parents and the community know what was going on, but they also, they cleared the school in the morning before anyone got there, basically, and then they brought in the dogs, and they bomb-sniffed the school, right? And it got the all clear, and there was increased police presence around the outside of the school. And so school happened that day, but then we did the event anyways, and it was beautiful, okay? There's folks out there with African drums, and it was just a wonderful, there was just singing and high fives, and it was just like this amazing event that really was like honestly, I mean, for lack of a better term, was sort of like a middle finger, like, to the fascists. Like, hey, we're going to do, you can't scare us. We're doing this anyways, and we're going to love our kids, and we're going to love our black kids, right? And we're going to come out as a community, and we're going to support this effort, okay? And so we did it, and it was incredible. Now, part of this then is to think about how do we, like, we need to be real about what the shift in the political discourse has happened in this country that allows someone to make a threat against a school like this, and to have these quote unquote news outlets like Blue Lives Matter or Breitbart kind of helping enable that kind of you know, the violence of language to be sort of wielded against folks. And we're seeing very real effects in school classrooms. These studies came out last year. 2 different studies came out. I'll talk about them a little bit both. But we're just seeing these impacts in classrooms with like in schools with like rises in hate speech and students just feeling free to like spout off racist or homophobic or anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant rhetoric because it's getting normalized, right? It got normalized through the presidential campaign and has been normalized in political discourse and also in policy. So some of the things we're seeing, okay? We have ICE arresting parents in the proximity of schools. We have parents or grandparents getting arrested by ICE. This was literally the case at John Muir where one of the grandparents of one of my son's friends was taken away and incarcerated. Kids are being, so this is the thing, kids are scared, right? I mean, they know what's happening to their friends and families or other folks in their communities. And so they're fearing for themselves, perhaps. They're feeling for their families. They're just feeling fear. Like they can sense it. There have been reports of like kids crying in the classrooms because they're worried about what's going to happen to them. I mean, imagine that, right? Like your aunt, your uncle, your mom, or your dad, brother or sister, like just being scared that they're going to be taken away. And then we've seen, obviously, in terms of policy, threats to public education, threats to special education, free lunch programs, after-school programs, public school funding. They came after Title IX, or they tried to for a minute. Transgender student rights, like basically, you name it. You know, in terms of like equity policies, and the Trump administration has at least done some nod to trying to get rid of it. Other things we're seeing from January to March in 2017, last year, right, over 100 reported this is a small chunk of time, too. Think about that. Over 100 reported threats or attacks on synagogues or Jewish people, almost 50 reported threats or attacks on mosques or Muslims. South Asian Indian Americans, right? This is how you have to just, in terms of sort of measuring the intelligence of the racists, right? Like they see someone with a turban on, and then they freak out and call them a Muslim because they don't actually understand about Sikhs and turbans, right? How that's actually completely different than any of the other stuff, right? So we're seeing South Asian Indian Americans targeted by white supremacists, right? Folks were getting shot at and sometimes killed, like in Kansas. People getting yelled, get out of my country and go back to your country, and often mistaken for being Arab or Iranian. A 2018 study, this report actually from the California Department of Justice, they were measuring the change in hate crimes from 2016 to 2017. That was the data they were looking at, and they saw a 17.4% rise in hate crimes. This is California specifically. 27.6% of the total hate crimes were against African Americans, and 15.7% of the total hate crimes were against gay men. And then there was a 51% increase in hate crimes against Latinx folks, and a 26.8% increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes, and a 24.3% increase in anti-Muslim crimes. So something's up. You can't just look at this data and go, oh yeah, it's business as usual, right? Like it's in the air, right? It's been normalized in very particular ways. And then this report was super interesting because it kind of found that a large bulk of the hate crimes being reported, like there was this huge spike in stuff happening at schools, right? Both in K-12 and in higher education, all right? Again, folks just feeling free to say stuff in public and out loud that maybe they were only thinking before or just trying to keep quiet, right on. And so this kind of set the imperative, I think, for us as educators, both K-12 and higher ed, to kind of think through we're in this space and what's sort of the moral political imperative for us around this work, right? I mean, and what's it going to take to sort of battle this rise in hate and hate speech and for our students. Some other key quotes. So thinking about K-12, which is where I do most of my scholarship, I don't know if you remember over a year ago, February 2017, there was the Day Without Immigrants, and then we had social media. Teachers were getting killed on social media because they're coming out and saying stupid stuff like this, right? Quote, that's what you get when you jump on some sort of bandwagon, a cause as an excuse to be lazy and or get drunk. Best school day ever, right? And this is the day when Latinx community was like, we're gonna be absent, we're leaving. So they would go and go protest and march, right? So these are teachers, mostly white teachers, saying, oh, this is a great day. These brown kids were gone, right? Another one, quote, quieter classes, more productive. Let's do this more often. Another one, quote, small classes, troublemakers were gone. Fantastic day. And this is Jurupa, California teachers. Naples, Florida, quote, the funny part about immigrants staying home is the rest of us who pay for them are here like we've always been. Looks like less mouths to feed today. Have fun while you still can. So glad to hear about massive deportation. Let's make America great again. Thanks, Donald Trump. Back in my home state of Washington, right? This is a first grade teacher at a public school in Prosser, Washington. Quote, this is a great idea, the day of essentially the day of absence, right? Day Without Immigrants. This is a great idea. It narrows the search down. If you'd like to report illegal aliens, please call Immigration and Customs, blah, 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 blah. If this has offended you in any way, do me a favor and unfriend my American ass. This is going viral on my daughter's Snapchat. Trump all the way. All right? And these public school teachers, right? And Prosser, you all don't know Prosser. Prosser's in eastern Washington. Like Washington's basically two different states. There's west of the mountains in the I-5 corridor of like Seattle, Olympia, Tacoma, Bellingham. Generally progressive, although I don't want to mislead you. We have our own kind of racism that we have in the Pacific Northwest. We have Northwest nice, but people are turning around and talking smack behind your back. And then we have Eastern Washington, which is very conservative, and Prosser's over there. But the other thing that happens in Eastern Washington is that this is a largely immigrant and migrant worker community, right? Because it's orchards and farms, and so these are teachers. This teacher, she's teaching immigrant and Latinx kids, right, in that space. There was a piece. This one is in what was it? It was Jersey. That's right. In New Jersey, students had recorded it when this teacher in their classroom was getting upset with them and saying, because they're speaking Spanish, right? And she said, speak American, speak English. We didn't go to war to fight so you could speak Spanish, right? And the kids walked out, of course, and good for them for doing that. So part of this is just to say that we tend to think about there's all this stuff. I know in the Pacific Northwest we struggle. There's all these groups. Proud Boys and like all these sort of white supremacist groups running around, Patriot, I can't remember, the Young Patriot folks or whatever, and we tend to think of them as like, oh, there's these wild folks out here who are just being racist and doing this thing. But part of this is to highlight, like, look, we're talking about regular public school teachers who are also like ventriloquating a lot of these same kinds of ideas, and they're the ones who are working with our kids. Right? And so it's really important to be thinking about that in this context. Okay, so then the question becomes, right, how do we think about multicultural education relative to this kind of madness, basically? So this is going to be a silly argument, but I'm just because I didn't know who my audience was going to be entirely, we'll back it down a little bit. Talk about why multicultural education in general is important, and then particularly within this context, and think through what kind of multicultural education do we want to be talking about. So, there are a socio-emotional value. There's a socio-emotional value to multicultural education, right? This is about folks, understanding themselves better, being in touch and being more empathetic to other people. Like there's a whole space around why we need multicultural education. And then there's actually cognitive benefits, right? Here's the thing about diversity, right? In general, the more diverse contexts you engage with, that forces you to reflect. It can force you to reflect and think and have to make more, basically build more synapses in order to understand all this difference and make sense of that, right? And so there's actually sort of a cognitive reason, a cognitive value for multicultural education, because the more kind of difference you interact with, the more potential for growth that you can actually demonstrate or have the potential to reach. And there's obviously, as we're seeing, a strong need for, multicultural education relative to citizenship and democracy. Now, I want to be clear, like when I use the term citizenship, I don't like to use that very much because citizen is like, it's a concept that's tied to the nation state, and when we're dealing with so many folks who are undocumented and dealing with ridiculous immigration policies like here in the U.S., I'm not trying to be exclusionary of those folks, right? But there is something about, how do we understand ourselves as a country? Okay, so I mean it in a broader sense like that. And what does it mean for all of us to be together and sort of be in this together, right? And multicultural education, is one of those spaces that's really aimed at we need to figure out, we're in the same boat, and let's figure out what it means to do that really. And multicultural education sort of is a space for us to think about that and work on that do that hard work. There's also a humanist sort of thing about multicultural education, right? Like how do we see each other? That's one of the biggest things I feel like we have going on now with all this hate speech is like folks just they aren't seeing each other. And so, not that I'm a colorblind humanist, I'm not promoting it that way. I don't believe in colorblindness like that. But I do think we need to be able to see each other for who we are and as people, both as cultural beings and racial beings, but also as not purely as individuals. I'm not individualist, but we just need to see each other, right? And so multicultural education sort of creates a space for us to be able to do that, or it can. And then multicultural education, obviously, because of its history, going back into the civil rights movement and before that, is something that is clearly sort of seen as a tool to battle both individual and institutionalized racism. Okay. And then if we're interested in educating all kids, right? And not, if we want to move away from Eurocentric models, from paradigms that only value, that place too strong of a value or overvalue, the Western canon of knowledge, for instance. If we're going to be working in these spaces that we're trying to reach everybody, then we have to take multicultural education seriously, because that's one of the imperatives of it as a field. And then we're seeing, multicultural education. The research has been pretty clear that Eurocentric curriculum is alienating for students of color, right? And this is actually all levels, K-12 and higher education. And that when we actually make very concerted efforts to, shift the paradigm in education around what we learn, so that people understand that their cultures and histories are valued in the educational spaces, that actually their engagement levels increase dramatically. All right. So a couple big questions then to be thinking about in all this. Okay. So thinking back to the quotations and the issues we're dealing with, and this is a really hard one, okay? Can someone who's fundamentally anti-immigrant or anti-LGBTQIA, anti-Islam, anti-Black for that matter, can they be trusted to care for our K-12 and higher education students, let alone be an effective teacher for all of them? Right? Because if there's one thing we know about education is that fundamentally, that relationship between student and teacher, right, is a caring relationship. Right, so I want to know about that teacher in Prosser. She's got Latinx students in her classroom. She has undocumented students undoubtedly in her classroom, right? And she's doing that. Now, what kind of care is being communicated in that space? Okay, you have to ask. I haven't been in her classroom. Maybe she's a loving teacher to her students. I don't know, right? But if that racism is there, it just raises that question for me. Okay, I had this issue when I asked the same kind of question when I was a professor at Cal State Fullerton, which is in Orange County, Southern California. And there was a very strongly conservative community there, a particular brand of Christianity that was pretty bigoted against lesbian, gay, queer, the queer community. And so I had folks in my multicultural education classes literally asking me, so out loud, I think you said this out loud, they would say if you know someone's lifestyle is going to put them at risk or peril, don't you think you should counsel them away from it? Right? And this was all subtext about working with gay kids, right? And I'm thinking, man, so this person's going to be a teacher, right? And here's the thing, as a professor, I can't grade on politics, right? That's unethical, okay? I can't say, oh, you failed because you are a homophobic bigot, right? You fail my class, right? I wish I could sometimes, right? But that's not my place, okay? So it raises the same question. Here's this person who's this homophobic person. They're going to go into a public school classroom, and they're going to be teaching kids who will be queer, transgender, gay, lesbian. You know, like that's the reality of our kids in schools, right? What kind of care is that person going to have for them, okay? Really, really hard one for teacher education because, again, we can't grade on politics alone. So what we do is, for all the teacher educators in the room will know, we couch it in the language of disposition, right? What are the dispositions of our candidates? You know. And here's the question we asked at John Muir, right? So in the midst of like the height of it, and like what were we willing to do if ICE came for our students? Because at the time, everyone, like all these communities were so nervous that for us it was never a matter of if, it was a matter of when ICE was going to come, even though ICE officially wasn't supposed to touch schools or churches. But we saw what was happening. They would wait outside of school or wait just outside the church and then grab folks, right? And so we were having conversations with teachers and parents like, okay, if something goes down, what are we going to do? And people were strategizing. Some folks were saying, well, maybe the school should go on lockdown because that way no one's allowed in or out, right? Then ICE can't go in, right? Other folks, I'd ask the question, okay, we need to figure out who's willing to come barricade the door with their bodies, right? Seriously, like who's going to put their bodies on the line to try and block ICE from coming in, right? But the fact that we had to ask the question was so maddening to me, but we really needed to because we weren't sure what was going to happen, okay? And then the other big question here relative to the talk that I'm giving is like, is multicultural education up to the task? This is asking a lot, all right? And so like, are we, if we're gonna think about in the frame of multicultural ed, is that good enough? Is that strong enough? Is it gonna be what we need to like protect our kids and communities? And here's the thing, like you can hear my language, I'm already operating out of a space of defense, right? That's not even talking about what our kids should be learning in a way, right? We're like, is it good enough to protect our folks? And that's protection is good and needed, but we also need to think about growth and sort of, how do we blossom in this space? Okay, so let me talk about some conceptions of multicultural education, sort of within this space, because there's all kind of different talks, because there's all kind of different talk around multicultural education, and it's one of those terms. Same thing with social justice these days. Right? In teacher education, we're all like, everyone's social justice. I'm like, okay, what does that mean, right? And the same thing in multicultural ed. Oh, no, who's going to say no to multicultural education? Well, it depends on what you mean, right? So thinking through a few different sort of conceptions of multicultural education. Here's the easy one. Heroes and holidays, foods and festivals, right? Not only is there alliteration between the words, but it's like, it's safe, right? It's like, oh, it's, I hate the term Hispanic, but it's Hispanic Heritage Month. It's going to be Taco Tuesday, right? I mean, like that kind of like super surface, like BS, like framing. I'm being multicultural because we're celebrating this food, or it's going to be this particular festival. Now, I'll say this with one little caveat, right? Having, my son's 8.5 years old. He's a third grader now. I understand that for little kids, you got to get in where you can get in, and it's not like, when my son was 5, it's not like I could he was going to fully grasp the length of institutional racism in this country and really engage in this stuff, right? So yes, when he's little in early childhood, we can go to some of these spaces and do that, but understanding that that's just scratching the surface, right? And also I want to be clear, even in saying that, some people say, hey, little kids, you shouldn't talk about race with them, right? And I'm like, no, because at 4 years old, 5 years old, we know that kids are actually already coming to consciousness about this stuff and building conclusions, and the identity formation is happening. They're already thinking in those terms, okay? And so the conversations that we need to be having with little kids. But obviously, developmentally appropriate, you can have very specific kinds of discussions with little kids. But anyways, this is the safe one, okay? And it's safe because you can do this without challenging anybody, right? No one's got to be racist. We're just all going to eat whatever festival food and do whatever, right? There's no actual racism. We're just enjoying this stuff. The other sort of easy one, right, is sort of additive, right? So, here's our curriculum, but we're going to have, it's Black History Month, so we're just going to do African American something there, right? Or it's Hispanic, Heritage Month, and we're going to do one little thing there, right? And so it just becomes you don't challenge the foundations of the curriculum, you just go beep, 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 and just give little bits and pieces, and we're being multicultural, okay? And again, that's safer because you're not really pushing the institution at all, right? You're not challenging the framework of knowledge, you're just adding a little bit. Here's another one, which most folks don't necessarily hear very much about, but I like to talk about it and frame around what I and others have called neoliberal multiculturalism. And this is using concept of multiculturalism sort of in the employ of neoliberal economics, okay, right? And so our kids need to be multilingual because of the global economy, right? So they need to learn Chinese because China's a rising superpower, right? It's like multiculturalism purely for this broader economic project, okay? And then there's also this other piece around it that pushes sort of and this one's a little more conceptual, but if you think about the way neoliberal economics works, it's the idea that there's an open and free market and everyone's just freely competing with each other. And in that kind of space, that's actually sort of a raceless space where everyone's seen as just an individual, okay? And so there's this whole there's the way that neoliberal economics uses multiculturalism in a particular way to try and frame itself as post-racial, right? And post-difference, okay? Because we're all equal individuals competing in the marketplace, right? And so, it just so happens that, most of Congress is white and male and X, Y, Z, and that's just the magic of the market. Here's another one of my favorites, multicultural education as the bridge, okay? Two different kinds of bridge. One bridge is to get to the real knowledge, right? Hey, we want our kids to learn Shakespeare. That's the important knowledge. And if I have to use Tupac to get them there, or Biggie, or hip hop, or whatever to get them there, then that's how I'm using it's like using multicultural education in the employ of supporting a Western canon, right? And you see that in a lot of different places, I feel like. The other one is we need multicultural education to close achievement gaps in testing, right? If we can just build the engagement, it's all about raising test scores, okay? Which leads me to, if anyone knows me, knows I do a ton of work around high-stakes standardized testing, or I have in my life. And so I got 2 slides around, I just need to do a quick tangent rant around this. Okay, so I want everyone to just think about, relative to this conversation in multicultural ed, to sort of understand high-stakes testing as a racial project, okay? And the construction of race and how people are racialized. And so here's a few quotes. I'm not, just so you can see. Testing as a racial project, right? Here is the language around achievement gap and achievement across multiple administrations. It's almost like they had the same speechwriter, from Trump to Bush to Obama to Duncan to Rod Page, right? Condoleezza Rice said the same thing. I used to have that quote in this bunch as well. And you see education being wielded in very particular ways, civil rights. If it's amazing to me that Trump can use that language in just the same breath that Obama can use the same exact language, right? Amazing. And so you get to see this whole idea, right? This thing around education, civil rights, and lurking behind all this is the idea of educational gaps and achievement gaps, right? As being this thing, this civil rights inequality. So why do I think about testing in terms of a racial project, okay? Because we know from every bit of research that all the negative impacts of testing disproportionately impact kids of color, okay? A lot of that has to do with because tests concentrate failure, and I would say it's a constructed failure in communities of color, then all the reforms that go along with it also get concentrated in communities of color, particularly working class communities of color, all right? And so then they see the most, this whole thing that happens with testing, hyper test prep, get rid of recess, get rid of music, or not get rid of, shorten lunch periods. Depending on what's tested, we'll have less science. Art's not on the test. We don't need to have that, right? And so all those kinds of reforms, and the teachers teaching to the test, and the textbook is test the line, and here's a script for you to follow to go with the, like all those kinds of like things, like this, you see this narrowing, right? This constriction that happens more because tests concentrate failure in communities of color, working class communities of color in particular, that constriction gets concentrated in those communities. So there's a disproportionate impact on the educational quality for kids of color. And this is one of the things like I think folks don't get, this common sense commitment to standardized tests. Standardized tests are not made for everyone to achieve, right? Like we have this idea, right? Oh, we can close the achievement gap, okay? But folks don't get that tests are constructed to produce a bell curve. Whether there's two kinds of tests, criterion reference and norm reference. And norm reference always produces a bell curve. Some people, you have a group doing high scores here, a bunch of people in the middle, and then people at the bottom. And then people go, well, criterion reference tests, right? Like our Common Core testing, that's just measuring the standards. Here's what they do. Smarter Balanced Testing, that's what we have, our Common Core test in Washington State. They take that data, and then they norm it on a bell, right? So that in the end, they're producing a bell curve with the with the criterion reference test anyways. And so what that means is that the tests are built to require failure, okay? You will never have everybody achieve on a standardized test, all right? There's a common sense test, a common sense argument. What happens when everybody passes? There's two answers to that. What's the response? Too easy or cheaters, right? That's all you get. No, you'll never, like the public can't even fathom the idea that everyone is well on a test because the logical construction of the test doesn't support that, all right? So what does that mean when we talk about these achievement gaps? Closing the achievement gap literally means equalizing failure and passing, making it proportional. It doesn't mean having all black kids pass and all white kids pass, or all rich kids pass and all poor kids pass. It means having the same number of white kids pass as every other racial group, and the same number of white kids failing as every other racial group, right? It's closing achievement gap only means making a proportional curve, right? So as long as we're using these tests and that framing for thinking about racial equality in schools, okay, we know what it's going to do, okay? Because the other piece of this that I don't have in the slide is that tests correlate most strongly, right, with non-school factors, okay? Poverty, lack of housing, food insecurity, lack of medical care, lack of dental care, okay, non-living wages for parents, right? Like these things actually produce, up to 70%, 80% of a test score, all right? And so it becomes this measure of inequality extant to schools, all right? And so we're never like using that tool, high-stakes tests as a tool, never going to get to any kind of racial equality. It's just an impossibility. All right. Now I'm off my tangent. Okay, so back to conceptions of multicultural education. So here's a couple of better ones, okay? There's more transformational conceptions, right? And in these ones, they say full integration in the curriculum, okay? It's not just the, additive approach. And it challenges presumptions about whose knowledge is of most worth, right? Here, that's a fundamental question, right? And this is the one thing, when you get into fights about curriculum, and my understanding is there's been struggles here at Colorado College about the West into the West class, right? And what is that? What is that? Weston time, right? So what does that mean to like? Here's this framing, right? And it's like, and you start as a tradition, and what kind of knowledge gets held in the tradition, and what are the politics around that? And then we start to, and then you poke at that, and like it's at the heart of so much of who we are and identities, right? It's true for curriculum everywhere. Okay, you see it in the fights in Texas, everywhere. Like if you start messing with the curriculum, you're poking at you're messing with like how people understand themselves. Okay, what vision do they have how do they define nation, for instance, or who we are, right? What Colorado College is, right? And as soon as you start going after that curriculum, you're raising those questions. That's really hard for folks. But what's happening is you're challenging the paradigm of whose knowledge is most important. Okay, and that's hard for folks. Like you see insecurity. Right? You see that right now, and I'm sad that my friend Angela Valenzuela and her panel on ethnic studies is somewhere else over here, across the street. Okay, but I've been doing work with ethnic studies, and they're doing work with ethnic studies, and the ethnic studies movement in K-12 is like asking this question, right? I mean, is the canon of dead white folks in history or literature, like, is it time to throw that out and understand that there's different kinds of knowledge and different communities of knowledge that actually just as powerful and need to be learned or just important. Anyways, the transformative piece also challenges school and cultural norms, and it really focuses on equity of access. That's one of the pieces here. But there are some limits to it too, and so I tend to go more in this direction too. So I embrace the transformational version, and then for me, I'm also over here in the social justice activist multicultural education, right? And so folks in this kind of framing understand it not as just school or curriculum transformation, but how do we challenge power relations and inequalities inside and outside of school? Like, this is a bigger kind of framing. And so we can have language around how do we challenge, like, the white supremacy of schools, right? Falls into this space. And then we have a really strong emphasis on building critical consciousness in students, right? Like, we want students to understand themselves as, like, really, really active folks who are in the world and who have power to, like, change things, okay? To have them, understand the unequal relations in our institutions and be in a position to, like, think about acting on that. And then the other piece of this, like, it's not all critique. It's also about how do we move forward and think about new ways of being. One of the things that I love that's happening now, both K-12 and higher ed, I'm seeing, is, like, people are talking about healing more, right? So when they talk, like, in studies we talk about what does it mean to decolonize sort of curriculum, and that's one piece of it. But where's the piece of having teaching and learning? That's actually about cultural healing too, right? And so there's more talk around restorative justice and transformational justice. There's all these other kind of spaces that are also growing. And not only just having the critique, we need the critique. We also think about how do we build something that's also going to help repair some of this damage and these legacies. Let's see. I'll try not to go too long. I know we get to like 45 minutes and people will start to fall asleep. So a couple questions. There's some things I like to think about too. I always like to push this with folks. I hate the word rigor. Like, rigor is like, it's like a cuss word for me, right? Because it's one of those things that gets used. Like grit too, like we do good with grit, right? Like right now. But anyways, rigor, right? Everyone's like, rigor, is it rigorous, right? And so you get, most times, like, people talk about advanced placement classes and, like, yeah, that's where all the rigor is. I'm like, no, you're just asking those students to do hella work, right? And that's one definition of rigor, like a ton of work, right? But it's not, like, how do we think about intellectual rigor, right? Or other kinds of rigor? So anyway, I like to ask the question then, sort of just within that frame, just to push on folks, what would it mean to have anti-racist multicultural rigor, right? Can we have, like, a requirement that students, quote unquote, meet standard in understanding structures and history of racism and other forms of oppression in this country? Okay? Can we have a requirement that students know and understand how to organize against institutional discrimination? I mean, I'm talking about creating our own gravediggers in a way, right? Like, I want my students to be really good organizers so they can help organize against my school, right? And so, but they need this kind of background knowledge to help them understand the institution and how to do that kind of work. And then what about teachers and administrators? Cultural competency is problematic, but it's all about language and framing. But in terms of, like, a minimum threshold for successful annual evaluation, can we have our teachers and administrators be evaluated against their ability to work with different groups of people? That's the most sort of liberal, safe version, right? Why not institute that? So some of this work, at least particularly in K-12, is happening in Rethinking Schools, and this is how we think about multicultural education. I'm just going to pop all these up so you all can read. So we think about teaching for social justice broadly, okay? Number one, the first one is the biggest one, being grounded in the lives of students. All right, and this is what I push when I'm working with teachers around doing ethnic studies work. Like, what are you doing to have the students and their communities in your classroom spaces? And that might be physical in terms of actual people, but also, I mean, like, issues. Like, anyone in these urban areas, like in Seattle, Portland, wherever, like, they should be teaching about gentrification. Students need to understand this process that's happening to them and their families and their communities, right? So what does it mean to bring, like, our curriculum needs to be grounded in what the students are experiencing in their lives. Teach through dialogue. This is a pedagogic thing, right? We don't believe in command and control, sage on the stage teaching. It needs to be an engagement, right? It needs to be Freirean dialogue in that sense. We want to critically support students' identities, and we put critically in there very purposefully, because if we just said, hey, we just want to support students' identities, like, what does that mean if you're dealing with a white nationalist student, right? I don't want to necessarily support that particular identity because there's a lot of racism there. But I do want to support them and help them better understand their experience in their lives, and I need to understand that too, right? Even the white nationalist student. So there has to be critical support. Embrace home languages, of course. We think kids can deal with serious issues, right? I mean, it's amazing. Shoot, my son's 8.5 now, and it's been so amazing to me to be a parent and watch this transformation and watch this young person come into his being. But the questions he asks at 8 years old now, like suddenly there's been this leap of like deep questions. I'm like, wow, okay. Sometimes you're like, oh, this wasn't in the handbook, right? I was not ready for this. But kids they think about stuff. They can do it. Anyways, we always argue academic rigor is impossible without teaching for social justice. We want to see it across the curriculum. We want to see it being connected to anti-racist struggle over content and a critique of Eurocentric knowledge. And I also want to celebrate social movements. Part of this is about we want to recognize the power of solidarity. And so there's all these movements that where people cut across lines, or they were race traders or gender traders or however you want to frame it, and they switch sides, right? And they united with people who are supposed to be their enemy and actually fought the good fight, right? There's spaces where people organize together, right? We want students to understand that too, because honestly, we're more powerful if we can build those solidarities. And then just highlighting a couple books here from Rethinking Schools, and I'll talk a little more about the Teaching for Black Lives book as well. But this is Columbus Day holidays coming up, then followed by Turkey Day, Thanksgiving, right? And so y'all should be get Rethinking Columbus, and you should be working with that book with students, right? Whether it's college or K-12, right? There's stuff in there. These things need to be taken seriously. So, I promised I'd bring this a little bit into higher ed, so let me just briefly touch on these things. I still feel like these principles all still same apply. This range of sort of multiculturalism. Our institutions of higher education are guilty of anything and everything that our institutions of K-12 education are guilty of. And we see lots of lip service to diversity, right? And tend to have, at least in my situation, there's always a lack of resources. I'm at a state institution. We're always resource constrained, particularly now. State funding for universities is sort of like an all-time low. Like we're in austerity funding. These days, my university, I think, is funded to the tune of 18% from the state, and the rest is tuition. So we like to jokingly refer to ourselves not as a state school. We're actually we're a state-located institution, right? Because we're mostly coming from tuition. So implementing this stuff and getting the real stuff done is the hard part. How do you build structures, right? How do you move this stuff into the actual institutions so that diversity work and multicultural education is actually taken seriously? How do we move it into the curriculum? And again, the struggle over here in Colorado College sort of represents that. What is the real administrative commitment to these things? And I struggle with that myself, right? How much am I, these days I'm the, I didn't like the term Chief Diversity Officer. My official title is Dean of Diversity and Equity for my university, right? And to what degree am I legitimizing the administrative rhetoric around this stuff? And to what degree am I actually able to do good work? It's a serious question, right? And it's the same thing you all are probably struggling with here. And I'm always fighting. Where are the resources for X, Y, and Z? Do I actually have any power in my role to say, hey, this hiring pool is not diverse enough? You need to either shut this search down or re-advertise it so you get enough folks of color into this pool, right? I mean, there's this ongoing tension. And I think it's important for us to recognize that all of our institutions are fundamentally conservative, and I don't mean that in liberal conservative, political dimensions. I mean literally conservationist. They try and conserve their current structure, right? And so change ends up being pushing against that conservationist sensibility to them. And I deal a lot with performative wokeness, both in my K-12 work and higher education work. I get a lot of white teachers or colleagues who are basically trying, to my face, they talk about, I'm down with this, I'm supportive of this, but then when it comes to actually how they're actually working with students, right, or what kind of curriculum changes they're willing to make, they mess up. The racism slips, right, or whatever comes out, and so yeah. I've also been thinking lately. Oops, let me see if I can go back. I've also been thinking lately how I feel like I like stuff, I like Vygotsky and the idea of zone of proximal development. I think in terms of a zone of proximal development for institutions. I think some institutions have very little or even regressive zones of proximal development, right? Like they really don't have space to go forward. I wouldn't have taken my job that I have now unless I felt like my institution actually had the space. The administration wanted to do this work, they were poised to do it. They just need the right people in the right places to actually make it happen. So I agreed to do it. Okay, and this is despite my radical politics and I'm completely unromantic about our institutions, right? They're still fundamentally white supremacists, they're still patriarchal, they still reproduce our inequalities. And so I went into this job doing diversity work knowing that, okay? But I also saw there's a lot of space for us to get good work done. And so, I'm actually building an office of equity and diversity, the first one that's going to exist on campus, right? So like, there's going to be institutional structure created. We're still going to be under-resourced, but it's going to be there. So I think different institutions have different ranges, and I think it's really important, like for you all working here, thinking about this work at Colorado College, to really ask that question, like, what is the zone of proximal development for Colorado College? Like, where is there space to get stuff done, and how far can it go? And the other piece of this, I think is similar, and I think my own activism and community organizing has helped me in this work, is I'm really super strategic about looking at which issues can get leverage, right? Where's the push and the buy-in? Because some things you come up against at an institution, you just run into it, it's like a third rail, right? And you're just gonna get zapped. But there's other spaces where you're like, hey, okay, I can see people kind of buying into like this program or supporting of first-gen college students, right? Like, all right, then we have some space and we can make some policy and structural movement in those spaces. And so just being real strategic about that and looking for the leverage points. We got obstacles for all this work. Obviously, in K-12 education, high-stakes testing, the whole accountability apparatus is blocking it at every step of the way. Okay. Then we're sort of struggling, of course, with the politics and racist ideology. We have this, none of it's easy, and it's not going to be like we have it's not going to be a quick win or anything. And so just to be real about the struggles of this work. But I think we have opportunities. I think Black Lives Matter and other political movements have actually created a lot of spaces for this kind of work to happen. So this is circling back to the beginning of my talk. This is our most recent book of Rethinking Schools, Teaching for Black Lives, co-edited with Diane Watson, Jesse Hagopian, and myself. And it's a beautiful book. It's been amazing. The response to it has been amazing. Fastest selling book in Rethinking Schools history, and we've sold out of the first run of 3,000 copies within 3 months. One of the coolest things that happened recently was that the performance artist Macklemore, and you may or may not feel good or bad about Macklemore. I'll say this, I'm from Seattle, and everyone from Seattle knows that Macklemore was on the grind as an underground rapper for many, many years before one song kind of blew up, and then suddenly he's like the Sting, right? But he was legitimately part of the Seattle hip-hop scene, doing his thing. But Macklemore, and the one thing about Macklemore is this, he's responded to critiques, and he's been supportive of local Black Lives Matter stuff. Really, really, he's invested resources, right? He's very present, and he's been good about that. But Macklemore came together with Michael Bennett, who's a former Seattle Seahawk and currently plays for the Eagles, also very outspoken and political. And they bought almost 600 copies of this book for Seattle Public Schools teachers. Right, and so there's folks, study group. There's things happening. So we see the space being created to do this kind of racial justice work, serious racial justice work in schools. And so there's a Black Lives Matter School Week that's happening now. It happened last year in February. It's the first week of this coming February. I'm not sure if anything's happening in Denver or anywhere here more locally. But folks have been organizing curriculum. It's Chicago and Seattle and Portland and a few other cities getting together to do that. Again, like I talked about earlier, the ethnic studies movement, there's stuff happening with ethnic studies up and down the West Coast, here in Denver, Austin. Providence and Chicago. It's happening. People are bringing ethnic studies into K-12 education, and there's a lot of space for doing really good work around that. I am a strong believer in teacher unions. Okay, I'm friendly and critical both at the same time. I understand the purpose of unions, and I think they're really important on the whole. But one thing I think folks need to understand, particularly in the K-12 community, is that you can take over your union. Okay, what folks do in Seattle, they created a progressive left-wing sort of caucus to push the union in progressive directions. And then what they start doing, they start running a slate of their own candidates to be reps at each of the school sites. And then they start to take over the rep assembly, right? And then, so what happens then is, when the Black Lives Matter in school stuff kicked off in Seattle, they had a whole force in the union to actually to push a vote and get the union to end up voting in support of us doing Black Lives Matter in Seattle schools, right? And so I believe in progressive unionism and the ability of folks to really move it institutionally. Local context administration, there are friendly administrators out there, you got to understand that, and so it's really worth understanding, who's doing what, and who's on your side and who's not. And then parents and community organizing, obviously, are critical in all of this. Parents are super powerful. And so again, in Seattle, we've been really good because we've been building stuff for years. Again, when the Black Lives Matter stuff kicked off in Seattle schools, we had the teachers union, the citywide PTA, and then the craziest thing happened. Like, the union sent out an email endorsing our Black Lives Matter on school day. Not the union, the administration sent out an email to the district saying that they endorsed our Black Lives Matter on school day, right? And they framed it as part of their broader racial equity initiative, right? So we had gained enough support that you all know how central administrations work at school districts, right? They are so conservative, they're so scared, they're so like cover your ass like approach to everything. And here they were like saying, hey, we support Black Lives Matter in school. Amazing that it happened. I couldn't believe it. So, but that happened because as soon as you start bringing the parents and community into stuff, the districts start to respond. These are some pictures from Oregon, students organizing when Forest Grove, Oregon, when some students put up a build a wall sign inside the school, and then students walked out. It was a great organizing thing. So this is the kind of, but when I talk about multicultural education being up to the task for now, this is the kind of multicultural education I want. I want the kind of multicultural education that helps students understand systemically what these things are, what these inequalities are, and helps them develop skills and capacities to be organizers, right? And really push us, okay, as the adults in the room, as the administrators, as the teachers, as the professors, to really make our institutions responsive to them. Here's some Black Lives Matter in School Day in Seattle. This is on the steps of Garfield High School. And you see the t-shirts. Other schools started making their own t-shirts, right? And then this is the John Muir staff from my son's school, so just to bring it back home. And then, let's see, where's my pointer? Oh, and that's Deshaun Jackson, the one who kicked it off with the 100 Black Men. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Now we'll open it up to questions, if I can get this mic out of the thing. There we go. Any questions? Comments, concerns? Anything?
Anything.
Don't be shy.
I'm glad you brought up our Weston Times. So my question for you is, what's your equivalent at UW-Bothell, and what are you working through curricular-wise, and what strategies would you have for us?
Well, we don't have an equivalent because we're so new. And so literally our campus is 25 years old as an institution, right? And it's amazing how much that changes things. I didn't realize it till I really got into it. And really, we started off as a 2-year institution, just upper division, because we're partnered with a community college campus. And then, it was only 13 years ago we started being a fully undergraduate institution as well, right? And so we don't have that equivalent. We do have something called Discovery Core, like a core thing, but we're so loosey-goosey about it that there's no fight about content. We have specific skills that go into it, and so in many ways we don't have that because we don't have the tradition, right? But that's one of those things. A lot of those things are curriculum is always tied to tradition, right? And so when you don't have a tradition, you don't have that same fight, yeah. But that's not to say we still got plenty of fights. I want to be clear, and we could fix so much of our curriculum, and so much of our teachers and faculty and staff need more. They need more skills on working with our super diverse student body. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you. as an education student, we've been talked about indoctrination and what that means in the classroom. And I wanted to ask you, how do we ensure multicultural activism without indoctrinating our students and trying to push them towards what we think is right?
Right. No, good question, and super loaded, right? There's several angles to go after that, right? One angle I always take is that you know, our students need to understand that every single adult in their life is biased, and I mean their parents too, right? And they're getting selected knowledge from everybody, right? And so in that sense, every single adult in their life is after some form of indoctrination for them, right? But I want them to understand that so that they can develop the critical skills around questioning and trying to figure stuff out for themselves. That's one piece. Another piece is I also think about, like, you know, I have students in my classroom. When they're not in my classroom or in my school, they're out in the world, and they're in this sea of, like, crap, right? I mean, like, they're in the sea of, like, whatever they're getting from this news source or everyone else, and so their consciousness is being shaped by all this other stuff, and so if they're coming into my space and it's the only time they get something that pushes back against it, then I think that's okay, right? Because it's this relationship of the whole versus this little part, right? And I am no way so powerful as to, like, overwhelm what they're experiencing outside of my classroom. So that's one piece. You know, another piece to me is that we need to, I like to push folks to think about, you know, like educational context, and think about what is the point, what is the point of education? Because fundamentally, I'm like, there's times when I think that maybe indoctrination is also not possible. Like, especially as someone, like, I've been a secondary teacher, a high school teacher, and I teach high school teachers, right? And I think, well, you know, when's the last time that a high school student just believed an adult based on what they said? Seriously, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, so maybe indoctrination isn't the issue. And what was interesting, there's even research to actually support that. Like, when people surveyed high school students and they were asked specifically, you know, does your teacher's political on X, Y, and Z influence you? And they actually were overwhelmingly like, no, it doesn't matter to me. Like, they just like engaging with the teacher on this stuff. So then I started questioning, okay, maybe it is or is not, you know, maybe it is not possible. And then the last piece I'll say is that to a certain degree, I think all education is also a form of indoctrination, all of it. Because, you know, any text you give, anything that's in that space is coming with a certain politics around it, all of it, right? And so then the point is not to be, like, in that way, it's impossible not to be, education is political. And to go into a space and say, well, you know, I'm going to be neutral, I think that's fake, right? And so to that degree, I think we need to come to grips with the fact that we're taking perspective with us everywhere possible. Now, that said, I'm not about, like I said before, I'm not grading students on political disposition, right? But I do want them to be able to, like, you know, articulate the stuff from class and be able to wage arguments around if they're going to hold a particular belief and be with this, then you better come with a defense of that, and not just think it's going to be free for all, sort of neoliberal. Every voice is the same kind of thing. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. In terms of making the curriculum, like, less unbiased and more with, like, more different perspectives, how would you ensure that, given that, like, whenever we, I don't know, learn history of social issues, like, even the way we learn history is already biased. Yeah. So how do we avoid that?
Excuse me. At all levels, it's all possible. So there's a great lesson, and it's in the Teaching for Black Lives, and it's a Rethinking Schools lesson Bob Peterson does with his fourth grade students. And so his fourth grade students were learning about presidents, right, as fourth grade students do. And then someone asked the question, well, did the presidents have slaves? Right? And then he said, okay, well, let's look what the textbook says. Right? And so the students went into the critical engagement with the text. And they're like, wait a minute, it doesn't say it. And he said, okay, well, let's go do some other research. right? And so they started to research and sort of unearth the like how many presidents owned, like quote unquote owned enslaved Africans, right? And were involved in plantation. So yes, history is taught in these particular ways, but you can actually take the tools that were given by the powers that be and use those very tools as a way as something to deconstruct them as well. And students are totally capable of doing that. So that's one piece. The other piece is I think like Rethinking Schools, we do a really good job of this, especially Bill Bigelow. Any of you know Bill Bigelow's work in teaching history and stuff, and like the role plays and stuff he develops are incredible. And so you take any issue and he'll actually write fictional roles that are historicized and have students argue it out and like basically learn about X, Y, and Z through this engagement. And then what you do is you create multiple perspectives, but his is multiple perspectives. It's not just one side and the other side. It's like here's 8 perspectives on NAFTA. Right, and you're getting the impact on the indigenous people here, and the maquiladoras here, and then you also have like the mega capitalist here, who's like, get rid of all trade rules, right? I mean, and then students engage in a fictional space, and then they debrief about it and pick through it and start to like think through that kind of stuff. And so I think there are pedagogical tools that we can be using that also help students just see the multiple perspectives and then weigh for themselves with the politics of it after they get done sort of chewing on it.
Yeah. Hi. First off, thank you so much for giving this talk. This was a very amazing presentation and definitely gave me a lot more to think about. Just going to be straight up, I'm not an education major, student, or minor in whatever capacity, but I am somewhat interested in political science. I was wondering, you mentioned that policy has a way of pushing against multicultural education, but do you have any ways that policy can push it to push multicultural education in our states or on a national level?
Yeah, I think that's. Thank you. Good question. And there's a broad statement, general statement, but when you get to specific locales, you see policies actually working in favor. So part of I would say, building in Seattle as an example, building off of the work we did around Black Lives Matter, folks were able to organize and get the Seattle School Board to actually pass a resolution in support of having ethnic studies in Seattle schools, right? So suddenly we have this policy kind of happen. California and Angela Valenzuela's across the street, like in Texas, talking right now, and she's from Texas. They have a state law on ethnic studies. There's been state laws in both California and Texas saying we need to have ethnic studies as graduation requirement, right? And so, but part of it is understanding how politics works, right? And that is that none of this would have happened if there wasn't a popular sort of uprising and a push on those politicians from a well-organized, large grassroots movement, right? Because they wouldn't. I mean, why would any of these politicians want to push? Be willing to support ethnic studies? Like it's not in there. That's too risky, right, for them in terms of getting voted back into office, right? So it takes that kind of organizing. It always takes that organizing to make that happen. But it can, it can and does happen. I just say it's not in the norm, right? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about student activism. So I saw in some of your photos there were a lot of student activists, and I have to be careful with how I say this because actually some of my students are over here on a field trip. But I've talked to some friends one friend in particular, he works at a public school in Queens, and his students are usually like way ahead of him in terms of let's get organized. They were the ones who led a March for Our Lives, stuff. And I tend to work at private schools. Some of the issues that are going on, socioeconomic, social justice issues, don't affect as many of my students as affect his students. And I struggle to get students to engage with activism, to think about their rights, to think about organizing. Do you have advice for how teachers can do that in a way that still feels authentic for the student, not necessarily teacher-driven?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a conundrum. You're not alone in that conundrum. Because I know folks, and I've worked with folks in like progressive independent schools in various parts, like in Seattle and other places, and they're very progressive, right? But it's also a pretty elite population, and so. And I think they struggle with how do you do social justice education, and also how do we sort of help folks understand themselves as activists. I mean, part of it is that there's sort of a calculus of like, the the degree and intensity that an injustice impacts you often, is directly correlated to like how much energy and how active you feel about it, right? And so when you have a more privileged population, they're just feeling a lesser degree of a lot of these issues, right? Some of them, right? So I agree. Like it can't come from teachers. Part of it, though, has to do with, to me, is like how do we? It's the same thing when I said about the institutions and finding the right leverage points. It's like, so then the question becomes, again, if we're going to think about what's going on in these students' lives, like where are those points where they're feeling an injustice or they're feeling strongly, and really trying to unearth that and figure out what that is. So that's one angle. The other piece is that there is a growing scholarship base around working with privileged groups doing this kind of work. So like my friend Katie Swalwell has a book called Educating Activist Allies, and it was research on like wealthy and privileged schools and doing like progressive curriculum and that kind of work, and trying to figure out how do we educate those students in ways that help them see themselves in solidarity with these other justice movements. But kids got to get fired up about stuff, and we know as teachers we can't just because I say it doesn't, they're not going to get fired up just because we say it. And so it's finding what they're fired up about, and then sort of taking advantage of that and figuring out, making that a curricular path.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the whole scope of education, in my opinion, has been so slow to change in general. What kids are taught in every single stage of their lives. It seems like the reading, writing, arithmetic, it's very limited and it hasn't changed in many years. So in terms of this aspect that you're talking about, there are some folks here that are going to be going into these public school systems or private school systems, and they're going to be teachers. And they have an opportunity to be amazing change agents within those schools. So what very, very specific tactical ideas do you have for them on a very small scale, perhaps, to be those change agents and push or create opportunities to think differently about how those students are taught to embrace some of these ideas that you've been talking about? Yeah,
it's true. Like, in a way, public education in this country is the same as it was 100 years ago, in a way, right? We still have a factory model, right? Literally, like, take any given high school, and students they're on the assembly line, right? They're the product moving from worker to worker. We're the teachers of the workers, and the bell rings, and they're moving in a time fashion, right? And they go ding, ding, ding down the line, and then they graduate at the end, right? And they've stamped their inspection, their diplomas, their inspection stamp. So it's like, so we have that structure, and so that's held true for 100 years. It's hard to change for a lot of reasons. Part of it is this 100-year-old tradition. Part of it, frankly, is a general commitment to sort of capitalist models and paradigms for thinking about education, right? Around thinking of it as production and think of it around, that's what testing is used for. Part of it is because also, and this may or may not rankle some folks in the room, part of it is because the current system and those styles and structures benefit some students over others, particularly middle-class students and the kids of professionals do quite well in this structure, even though it's stifling. Like, they see the stiflingness, but they're also do very well in it. And so when you try and push on those things, it can actually create a large amount of resistance from those communities. And if you don't believe me, I would say just try and find a school that has tracking and go try and stop tracking there, and then see who fights you, right? And so there's all those things. In terms of really concrete advice for making changes at the level, so part of this is to say like, and this is something I ask my own students to do, like, number one, if you are going to be a teacher who wants to try and implement some of these changes, the first thing you need to do is like really learn your kids and their communities. And I mean really learn them. Don't just look at the state reported demographics. That'll help you. But for instance, look who's in your classroom in front of you, and then figure out how those communities arrived historically in your area, right? Like in Seattle, we have a large East African, Somali, Eritrean, Amoro community, and like that's for a particular reason, right? And the reason why that's important is because we'll have students in front of us in Seattle who either themselves or their brothers or sisters or aunts and uncles or parents actually came as like refugees from war and maybe had to like literally walk through a battlefield to get to where they were, right? And understanding that creates this opportunity to really engage with them in really substantive ways, and just you need to understand your kids. So that's one little piece. The other piece I always tell my students is to study your institution. Like honestly, and I didn't mean this. I'm very pragmatic and practical about this stuff. So like you need to figure out like who your allies are and who aren't your allies, and where's your administrator at on X, Y, and Z policy, and why is that the case, and where can you push them, right? There's all these things you can do, and the reason why I say that is important to this because if you don't do that, you'll step on a landmine, right? You'll step in the poop somewhere, right? And then and that'll be it. Like especially if you're a brand new teacher, you lose your job, right? And you have to figure out where that is. And so there's that little piece. So you need these things. And then the other piece of that is building relationships. That's also what that part of that is. Because if you find who the allies are, you build those relationships. You understand your kids in their communities, you start building relationships with their parents, and you start doing that because you are way more powerful as an organized network than you are as an individual, and that starts creating space for you to do that stuff. Other things, I think there's just a ton of small things you got to be doing in your classroom spaces. We had open house curriculum night at my son's school a couple weeks ago, and just because of who's in the school, his teacher, third grade teacher, I mean every single handout was translated. I think it was 5 languages, and just there, as a given. Right? But that's what she had to do, right? And so those smallest things. And then she had asked the families as they came in, she asked them to, there was a board up here, and she was asking them to write in their own language how they say hello, right? I mean, just little things that kind of say, hey, you are welcome here, you belong here, I'm seeing you, right? Any of those little things you can do are the baby steps. I mean, that's just the baby steps for like Black Lives Matter in schools, right? Like are those little things. So celebrating your kids and letting them know that you see them any way possible is critical. Yeah.
Hello, I'm supposed to say I'm the last question, by the way. So thank you, by the way, for this speech. My question is, so I'm from Minnesota, and it's very white in the rural areas. Minneapolis is, very diverse. But something I'm just wondering, and I've been wondering because we've been learning about multicultural education in our class, is how can that be implemented and effective in schools where there is no diversity, so students don't really have any exposure to it?
Yeah, a great question. One of the things I love about ethnic studies, this is like the first thing I say for for those contexts is like a lot of people don't get that the way sort of white supremacy, the way that institutionalized racism and sort of Eurocentric knowledge and stuff in our schools, that has actually miseducated white people about themselves, right? And so to me, it's critically important that in a non-diverse context, I think those schools should start by deconstructing whiteness, right? So that those students can understand, hey, this thing that I've been told I am, this identity as American or X, Y, and Z, is not what it is, right? And this idea of the white race is, is so very constructed, right? And they need to know that because they need to know themselves for who they are. And what that does then is that becomes the window to open up a similar deconstruction of all this other stuff around other groups, and it creates this space where you can start saying, you've been lied to in history about X, Y, and Z too. That's part of the construction of whiteness, right? And it's not to just sort of revel in the fact that white folks have had privilege or that kind of thing. Especially if you're talking about Minnesota, I lived in the Midwest, and folks actually do have some sense of their ethnic origins as white people, much more than on the West Coast, for sure. And so, I think, students who got Irish heritage need to understand that the British, colonized Ireland, right, and Scotland, and saw them as savages and painted them as black, like that. I mean, they need to understand those same processes that happen now in terms of white racism and anti-blackness in the U.S. were actually wielded and practiced on them, And that helps them understand, like creating these windows for understanding all these other forms of oppression that they weren't able to connect to, in part because they just have maintained a totally sort of misconstructed identity, or purposely constructed, really, but it totally miseducated them about who they really are. So so that same premise: start, ground it in students' lives, start where they are. Still the same thing. It's just like you're not going to be able to like bring this work into that space and be like, oh, you're going to believe it, right? Because it's outside their experience, and they're not necessarily going to believe it, But that, and there's also issues that folks are dealing with. I mean, class is, economic class is huge in those rural communities, and there's so many things to go after around that, right? That have natural linkages to all of this, right? And so, you just have to find those points of leverage that you can make those connections and then help them see the world in this kind of different way. Yeah, right on. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time.